So hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today at rstats. Slide. So rstats is a local chapter is part of a worldwide organization, rstats Global. As you can see, rstats chapters have been active across different regions, and the number of chapters is always growing. rstats aims to dedicate more support towards improving gender diversity in the R community and to support all our users all over the world, because I know that you have people today joining us from different corners of the world, and this is something beautiful. So it was founded in 2016 and is built on knowledge sharing. It's currently running by me. I'm Muna Bilaid, and I'm business intelligence consultant at Prime Analytics. I'm passionate a lot about volunteering, coding, and bringing people to share knowledge. rstats is also present on social media. You can follow us on Twitter or join our meetup group. So this is where we'll be notified about our future meetups. We are also present on GitHub. So we have also a GitHub organization. So this is where all the materials of the previous meetups are available. And this is where we are going to store the materials of our future meetups. And we are also going to share the recording videos on our YouTube channel. So please make sure to follow us. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or also join our WhatsApp group. So this is where you can get me, I would say, maybe closely in touch with the rstats community members through discussions. And this is where you can learn more about each other and also from each other and improve our art skills. You can maybe share about on WhatsApp about your projects that you are working on. So please don't hesitate to join us and to introduce yourself there. I will make sure to share with you the links in a bit in the chat. Yeah, what about the upcoming R-related events? So you can participate in the RStudio 2022 table contest. So this contest aims to highlight the many great ways people transform and present data by building beautiful and useful tables. And this year we would be using either R or Python. So the deadline for submissions is Friday, November 18. Sorry, there is also the R Pharma conference, which will focus on the use of R in the development of pharmaceuticals and will take place from November 8 to November 10. And what is beautiful is that the conference will run as an online event with 23 workshops the week before. You can also stay tuned for updates on the upcoming rstats events around the world on Meetup. I will also share with you in a bit in the chat the links to get access to these events. Yeah, what about today's meetup? So today's meetup will serve as an introduction to ggplot2, and you learn how to make attractive plots in R. Therefore, we are so pleased to be hosting Tanya Shapiro. So she's a freelance analyst and content creator with a passion for data viz. For the past 5 years, she has worked in several data roles with the insurance industry, so using either R or Python. And when she's not working on data projects, you can find her working out on her Peloton or exploring downtown in Florida. Yeah, before we start, last thing. So as you see, yeah, you plan to this session is recorded today. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to leave your question in the chat. And before we leave later, I have a form to share it with you. So please don't hesitate to give us your feedback. It will help us to improve the quality of the workshops that will be organized. rstats has a code of conduct, so please let's make this place a welcoming and friendly community for everyone. Thank you so much for your attention, and the screen is yours, Tanya.
Awesome. Thank you, Muna, for the warm introduction. I'm so excited to be part of this today. thank you all for joining from whatever part of the world you are, whether it's good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. Today, we're going to dive right into our notebook. I just chatted out the link to GitHub, but don't worry, if you're not familiar with GitHub cloning repos, we can also just go ahead and download it. So I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. All right, just looking for a thumbs up from Muna that you can see my screen. Awesome, perfect. Okay, so once you get into the GitHub repo, if you're newer to GitHub, what we can go ahead and do is just download it directly to our computer. So go ahead and download the zip. And then within the zip, once you open it up, go into the code folder, and there's a couple of options. So if you're someone who wants to participate today by doing hands-on coding, I recommend looking at the ggplot starter notebook. For those who want to sit back and relax, it's happy hour, you want to take it easy. There's also a solution notebook where you can just follow along. And so if you're just starting and you can't catch up with coding, you also have the solution notebook with all the answers at the end. So go ahead and open up the starter notebook. You should have RStudio downloaded beforehand, as well as our Markdown. So once you go ahead and open up the starter notebook, you should see it pop up here in the RStudio IDE. Quick heads up, if anybody is experiencing issues while we're going through this workshop, Muna has graciously volunteered to help troubleshoot, so feel free to use the chat to ask any questions if you have any issues, and she'll be able to jump in and help you as we're going through this together. I'm going to give folks a couple of seconds to download and open up their notebooks. Other thing, if you're struggling to open up the notebook, I also have the HTML version of the notebook available here. So if you click on the repo and open the link, you'll see that the code chunks are already there with the content available. So don't stress out about it if you can't open up our Markdown. There's also the HTML version. All right. So I totally nixed the slides for today. I felt we'll get right into it, make the most use out of our time. I'll give you a quick rundown of RStudio and how to navigate RStudio. We're going to go through a quick setup, explore our data, and then learn more about ggplot, which is an awesome data visualization library in R, and then get right into creating 3 different plots using our data. So when you open up RStudio, you'll notice 4 different windows. So in the top upper window, you have here, you should see source and visual. When you open up your RMD file, I recommend using visual. It's a lot nicer to look at. The reason that we're using an R Markdown notebook today, I think it's really cool and interactive where it lets us execute one piece of code at a time. You're welcome to use an R script too and copy paste the code as we go through it too. Below is the console. So when we're executing the code, you should see it populate there. Here you have your environment. So as we start creating data frame objects and storing information into variables, you'll see it populate in that part of the window. And then down here, you also have like your packages and plots. So if you're struggling to download any of the packages too, you can also use the UI here to install directly from CRAN. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get set up. First part that I want us to run is this top setup piece. Quick note, to change your working directory in an R Markdown notebook, it's a little bit different than a script. So instead of doing set WD, we can use knitr and the root.directory to set it here. I have it defaulting to desktop, but if you know the path of the place where you want like your plots to be saved, you can change that path in here. Okay, all right. Getting right into the agenda for today. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on setup with installing libraries. Going to get right into data prep. Anybody who thought we're getting away with just plotting and not doing any data prep, I'm sorry. That's part of it, is always the data wrangling and doing a little bit of data cleanup. We'll be exploring how to do that with dplyr today. And then going right into plotting, we'll be using ggplot heavily. and then a ggplot supporting character or a ggplot extension as we go through this. So I want us to go ahead and run this setup chunk. I tried to make this bulletproof, so if you have it already installed, it'll skip over it. If you don't have these libraries installed, it'll automatically go ahead and install the libraries for you. And you can check whether or not you have them installed here by looking at system libraries. So the 4 packages we're going to be using today are tidyverse, ggimage, sysfonts, and showtext. I'll give folks a couple of minutes while that loads if it's your first time, and I'll go right into just explaining high level what these packages are and how we're going to be using them today. So you'll notice that we're not explicitly loading in ggplot2. Don't worry, we are using ggplot2 in this workshop. That's exactly the title of the workshop. There's a lot of ggplot here. Instead, we're loading in tidyverse, which is a collection of R packages. So the reason I'm loading in tidyverse is because we're going to be using dplyr in conjunction with ggplot. We'll be using readr to load in the CSV file as well. We're also going to be using a ggplot extension package called ggimage. There are several different extension packages out there. I have a link in the notebook. Oh, by the way, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to read as we go through this, that you can explore. One of my favorite ones is ggimage. It'll let us plot image URLs. You can also plot images from your local directory too. And last but not least, my favorite part of changing up ggplot is with changing up the typefaces. So to make this part easier, we're working directly with sysfonts and showtext. That way, if you don't have a font downloaded locally, it's no problem. It'll go ahead and borrow some of the fonts from the Google Fonts library layer. So I want us to go ahead and execute the next code chunk, which is just calling in all of our libraries. You'll notice that the code executes down here. The way that you know that your code is completed is you have this little arrow symbol at the end. Awesome. Last but not least, for our setup, we're going to be loading in our fonts with the sysfonts package. So we're using a function here called font add Google. I'm working with one of my favorite sans serif fonts, Roboto. You're welcome to change up the font at a later time. There's a whole list of them on Google's font library that you can explore. And because we're doing a special themed workshop, I'd be amiss if we didn't have some kind of creepy, spooky font to load in as well. So go ahead and load in Creepster too. Last part of this, we're using showtext, and showtext will help us automatically render that within our plots. Okay, all right, setup, check. Now to get familiar with the data prep step. I definitely gave away the theme yesterday on Twitter for those of you who are on the Twitterverse, but the theme for today is going to be horror movie related. As a Floridian, I get excited when there's like a cool breeze in the air and it's October. It feels like fall. For those who live in Florida, you know it's like summer all year long. And it just felt right to do something spooky or Halloween themed. So we're working with a database, a data set today that comes from the movie database. There's about 35,000 different horror movies on there, dating all the way back to the 1950s. So like, think of House of Wax all the way up until today, with popular franchises like Scream and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Got to give kudos to Georgios from the Tidy Tuesday world as well, because when I was browsing which data sets to work with, this was one of the options. And I love that he had a whole bunch of horror movies listed in. I wanted to expand on the data set, so I went ahead and wrangled a completely new data set from the movie database. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Little Shop of Horrors, but this is the pun that I was attempting to make. So a little workshop of horrors for today. There's a data dictionary available too that outlines what are all the columns, what they mean, and some examples, but let's go ahead and load in our data set. So under preview data, I want us to go ahead and run this code chunk. So to execute code chunks, you can click this green play button. You'll see that a tibble is automatically rendered within our code chunk below. You'll also notice that within your environment up here, you have a new data frame object called raw. This is just the raw data that it's loading from the GitHub repository. And if you want to explore the data in full, you can also click on this to show the entire data set. So if you notice here, like each record represents a specific horror movie and it has details pertaining to that horror movie. So Orphan First Kill here, I think that's a newer one, part of the Orphan franchise. I don't know if we have any horror buffs on the line. You see the release dates, there's a poster path. You have metrics related to the movie, so popularity, the vote count, vote average, budget and revenue, runtime, which I believe is in minutes, and then a couple of other descriptive fields, so like the genre names, and then whether or not that movie is part of a collection. If you want to take a look at the data types too, you can also open up the data frame here and notice the different data types that we're working with. Now, luckily, most of the data is already in good shape, so this part should be relatively quick. But I would be amiss if we didn't get to play around a little bit with dplyr in this workshop. So for those of you who are new to R, think of dplyr as your go-to tool for reshaping the data, cleaning the data. You can do a number of different things with dplyr. There's a bunch of functions. We're going to go over a few of them today. I've attached a quick cheat sheet that's developed by RStudio, which is really useful. But we'll be using it namely today to filter data, to aggregate our data, and to even add some new columns and clean up existing columns. So the first thing that I want us to do is I want us to take that budget. So if you notice, budget in here is expressed in like dollar amounts here. Oops, where is it? I want us to create this, express it in millions. So we're going to go ahead and create a function to convert this to millions. We're also going to be working with the release date. I can see it's already in date format here, so there's no need for us to cast it. But I want us to go ahead and create some new variables called release year and release month. So we're going to be truncating our date on year and month. And then we'll also be adding the poster URL. So we have a poster path in here, but it doesn't connect to the actual parent URL. So to get started, I want us to start typing in our code chunk and start off with raw. And now I know that there's probably going to be two camps of R people on the line. Whether you use the Moderator pipe or the base pipe, completely up to you. I'm going to stick with the base pipe here. So this is how we can start passing in dplyr functions specific to our data frame. And then I want us to go ahead and indent. And what we'll be using is the dplyr mutate function. So here, to override our budget column, we're going to say budget is equal to, and then pass in budget. By the way, one of my favorite parts of RStudio is that it pre-populates your column names as you start typing. So if you're a lousy typer like me, it's a very useful tool. And then divide by 1,000,000. And I want us to go ahead and add the comma. So we're going to continue building on this. Type in revenue, and then also divide by 1,000,000. Now to create a new column, we want to call this release year. The way that we can truncate a date is by using the function format, and then we can pass in release year. And then I think for those who work in SQL, this should be a little bit familiar too, where you do like the percentage year to truncate on year. I think percentage B for month abbreviation, etc. And then release month. Oh, excuse me, folks. This should be release date. We haven't really created release year yet. All right, and then last but not least, we're going to be creating a new field called poster URL. And one way that you can concatenate strings together is by using paste. And because I don't want any spaces introduced when I'm concatenating, I'm going to use paste 0. And here we're just going to list the order of the strings that we want to paste. So up here, we've stored this link here to the movie database in a base URL variable. So we'll go ahead and pass that in. And then we'll also pass in the poster path. And I want us to go ahead and just run this for now. Come back to it. So notice it creates a table below. But now I want to store this in a new data frame object so we can use it in the future. I'm going to be very original with naming my data frame object as df. And then to store it, we're going to be using this arrow. So you should see now in your environment that you have a new data frame object. One thing to note when you're casting your dates using format, it's going to be introducing this as a character and not numeric. So we're going to do one last thing before we move on, which is making sure it's expressed as a number and not a character. So what we can do is wrap this with a function called as numeric. And go ahead and hit run. Now you should see that your data types here in your environment are expressed as numbers. Awesome. I'm actually going to pause right here just in case there's any questions before we move on to the next step. Muna, anything coming in from our chat?
Could we? Yes, please. So, could you stop? No, it's not a question. Just we have Monica. She's not able, like, to be able to follow along with you. Sorry. So, is it okay for you, Monica, for the error? Maybe you could let us know in the chat.
So for those of us who are just joining, sorry, is Monica on the line?
I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think she's still online, but maybe she's unmute. She's able to.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying. I'm trying at the same time to listen and download the file and do the conversions, and I'm just not getting anywhere. Sorry.
It's fine. So is it okay for you? Like
no, I haven't got the file. I haven't been able to do the mutations. Everything is just going a little bit too fast.
Okay, I will share with you the link again. It's okay.
Yeah, I have the link. I just get this odd error, and I know the file is in the data folder, and I'm trying to fold it, but I can't do it all at once. That's the problem.
Okay, I will follow with you in the chat. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I will put again the link. So you have a request from someone else.
So for those of us who are just joining, Moon is going to share the link to the GitHub repository. You can go ahead and clone the GitHub repository or download it via zip file and try opening up the R Markdown files. No stress if we're going a little bit too fast for today. We do have the solutions posted, and we're also going to post a recording of this later on. So if you're trying to code along and we're a little bit too far ahead, don't worry about it. The solutions are all there at the end of this workshop. Okay, all right. So we're gonna move on to the next part, which is the plotting stage. I originally had like the ggplot cake graphic in here, but I'll go ahead and try to do this without a supporting slide. So before we get into ggplot, let's go over some basic concepts of ggplot. ggplot, I like to think of it a little bit like a cake in the sense that we're creating layers. We're using different functions within ggplot to map our ingredients within our data frame. And then one of my favorite parts of working with ggplot is also all the customization options that you have with themes, or what I like to think of it as like frosting on a cake. There's other components within ggplot that we're going to be that will be exposed to while we go through this. So for mapping variables, we'll be using a function called AES for the aesthetic mapping. To tweak some of our ingredients, we'll be using scales. You can do that to tweak like the x-axis, y-axis, anything from colors to shapes and sizes. And then we'll also be working with labs, which is an easy way of adding in plot titles. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the next thing. So one last call out though, the layers that we work with, you'll hear me refer to them as geoms. So for different chart types, we're going to be playing around with different geom types. So geom point, for instance, will be one that we'll be learning as we build our scatter plot. Okay. All right. On to my favorite part, plotting. So for the first prompt, I thought it would be cool to dive right into slasher films. For those who are not as familiar with horror movies, it's a subgenre of horror. Think of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, Friday the 13th. We were so close to being Friday the 13th. I know it's Thursday the 13th, but we'll pretend it's spooky season here. Little graphic to explain the slasher movie essentials from John Atkinson. So we'll dive right into it. And the first thing that I want us to do is take our data frame and filter just to show movies that belong to the collection Halloween, Friday the 13th, Scream, or A Nightmare on Elm Street. I've done some of the typing already. So we're storing this, the list of franchises in a list, which you can do with C and parentheses. And then we're going to be using our friend dplyr again to create a new data frame object. So go ahead and call this data frame object df_slashers. And then just like before, start building the pipe. By the way, if you're familiar with the Moderator pipe, you can also use the percentage greater than percentage symbol. I'm trying to get used to the base pipe here. So df, and you're going to say filter slashers. And then to set the criteria that it's contained within a list, we're going to be using a function symbol in slashers. And then to preview our data, we'll be using the function of head. And let's just preview the first 5 rows of data. Not size. Just a moment here while I troubleshoot. Oh, my bad, folks. I can't, I'm not paying attention to the variable names. So within df, there is a variable called collection name. So we're going to be filtering collection name in slashers. So now we can see like the first few movies pertain to Halloween. You've got Scream. There's a bunch of others in the series. Now to keep building on our dplyr functions, we're going to continue piping. And I want us to do one last thing, which is clean up the collection name. So having collection over and over again is a little bit redundant. So we'll go ahead and use our friend mutate and override the collection name with gsub. So gsub is how you can take a pattern and extract it or replace it with a different pattern. So the pattern we're trying to find is collection. We're going to replace it with an empty string, and we want it to find replace it within collection name. To make this a little bit more legible as well within our data set, I want us to subset columns. So the way that you can subset columns with dplyr is with a function called select, and then you start listing in the column names that you want. So I want here title, I want the collection name, I want to bring in budget, revenue, and popularity. All right. Just to confirm, check that you have the new data frame object here. You should have 34 different records within your data frame. Okay. Now, finally, we get to the fun part, which is ggplotting. So the first thing that I want us to do is set up our ggplot. So every time you start a ggplot, it's always going to start with that parent argument of ggplot. And there's two main arguments that we're going to be passing into ggplot. One is you want to specify which data set you're using. So here you're going to say data is equal to, and then map it to our new data frame df slashers. And then the other argument that we're going to pass in is the mapping. So with mapping, if you're mapping it directly to something within your data frame, you're going to be using AES. And the classic setup for our scatter plot, we want to say AES. And let's go ahead and compare budget against revenue. So I want us to map X to budget and Y is equal to revenue. And to keep building on ggplot, you're going to be using the plus sign to keep going. So once you have that wrapped in, go ahead and on the next line, type in G on point. So here we're specifying G on point. Go ahead and click run. Oh, did I mention I'm a horrible typer? If not, this is evidence here that I'm a horrible typer. GG plot. Great. It should look something like this. So now this represents a bunch of movies, and we can see it's plotted against the budget, which is expressed in millions, and revenue, which is not expressed in millions because I missed a zero up here. I'm so sorry. Let me go back to the data prep real quick. Okay. That's going to be important for the future. So just making sure that I've got millions up here in our basic setup. If you're like me and there's an error, you're going to have to go ahead and rerun the code so it stores the same information in your df slashers data frame. There we go. Now, the last trick that we're going to be using in the setup for our basic scatter plot is working with labs. And there's a couple of ways that you can change the title within ggplot. I like using labs because it lets me do multiple labels within one go. So we're going to keep going, add the plus sign at the end, and type in labs. And then you can pass in a title argument here. So we can say slasher, let's call this slasher movies, budget versus revenue. We can even relabel our X and Y axis. So you could say X is equal to budget, and we might want to call out that it's in millions. I'm going to keep going by adding a comma after each argument. Y is equal to revenue millions. And then I always think it's good practice to call out what our data source is, and I typically do that within the caption of a plot. So we can add a caption, and we can say data from the movie database. Go ahead and run that code. So quick call out for those who have used ggplot before. We know that it defaults to this out-of-the-box great custom theme. One thing that you might notice a difference is the typography has changed. So now it's adopting Roboto instead of the typical font that it comes with. If you're having errors with that, I definitely go back and look at how you're loading sys fonts. But I like it because it's easy to load in and then it automatically renders in ggplot. All right, not a bad start, but we can definitely crank this up a notch. So within our ggplot, let's say now I want to take a look and compare movies from different slasher franchises. This is a little bit difficult to do given the current state. So one way that we could do this is by changing up the dots. So let's say we want to add color to each of our points to represent the different franchise that it comes from. You can also make the scatter plot look like more of like a bubble graph by increasing the size based on a variable. So there's a lot more that you can do by changing up the arguments within AES. So the first thing that we did within AES was just pass in X and Y. But in this step, I want us to go ahead. If you are a lazy typer like me, feel free to copy paste the code from the code chunk before and go ahead and paste this. And we're going to continue to expand on this. So within here now, within our AES mapping, we can add the size, and we can also add the color. So let's go ahead and play with that. So let's say size is equal to popularity, and then go ahead and set color is equal to collection name. And I like to indent things when it starts wrapping around, so you can always indent, and I find it to be a little bit more legible that way. And you can go ahead and, well, popularity. And you go ahead and run. And now you notice that it's changed up the color of our dots that correspond with the collection name. And it's also changed the size and popularity. Honestly, I'd have to do more digging on how they determine popularity on the movie database. All I know is that the bigger the number, the better. So the bigger the bubble, the more popular the movie is. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to continue building on this with a couple other tricks. So let's say that you're not in love with the default ggplot colors that it does with the mapping. We can change this up by using scales. So this is the first time we'll be working with scales today. And there's a couple of different things that we can do with scales, but I'll show you today how you can use scale color manual to customize and be really specific with the colors that you want to select. There's a bunch of other color palette libraries. As a side note, I have it here in the Markdown workbook. So if you want to check them out, feel free to do so. If you're a nerd like me and you want to go pick out your own colors and you don't know the hex codes, you want a palette generator, there's cool sites like Colors that I tend to default to. But I've got some pre-selected colors up here. So go ahead, I want us to copy that. So on the next line, and by the way, you can keep building after labs. There's no specific ordering for this one. When we get into how to layer geoms, the order of which you build is going to be a lot more important. But the first thing always needs to remain constant, which is that ggplot argument at the top. So I'm going to add my scale right under here for labs. Go ahead and type in scale color manual. I always add a plus sign when I'm done because I tend to forget the plus sign by the time I'm done passing in the arguments. And the argument that we're going to work with here is values. So what it's expecting us to do is to pass in a list of values that's the same length as the list of values that we have listed here. So we have to pass in 4 different color names. So we're going to do this by creating a list. Then I want us to go ahead and copy paste the variables within this list. And you can go ahead and run the code. Now you see that it's changed up the colors. I know they're not specific to the franchise. Trust me, most of these slasher franchises have like red as the default theme, so it wouldn't do us a lot of good for noticing the discrepancies. I've kind of picked a random palette from Colors. Okay. By the way, if you're having issues with sizing in our Markdown notebooks, there's a couple of different things. I'm admittedly newer to our Markdown notebook, so it might not be rendering the way that I would prefer. But you can change like the figure aspect ratios here in the top code chunk. So if we wanted to make this smaller, we could. Last thing, let's go ahead and play around with themes. So for this chunk, I just want us to work with one of the default themes that comes with ggplot. So you can do this by adding. And then I want us to insert theme here. I prefer theme minimal. I think theme minimal dramatically improves the aesthetic of a plot without having to do much, but you're welcome to explore some of the other themes that are available. There's a whole list of them here if you click the link. And notice how it removes that gray background. Similarly, if you want to change up the labels in your legend, you can keep doing that within labs. So this is going to accept the same value from our mapping. So if you want to change the popularity label, you use size. You can capitalize this. And then for color, maybe we want to call it franchise instead of collection name. One last trick before we wrap up our plot. you can also change different parts of the plot without passing in like a mapping to your data frame. So we could be specific about changing certain, like the certain look of feel within the geom point. One thing that we can do is change the opacity of the bubbles. So typically, like when you see these things clustering over each other, I like to change up the opacity so it kind of breaks it up a little bit. So we can do that with an argument called alpha, and alpha accepts values from 0 to 1. So the closer it is to 1, the more solid color looking it's going to be. The closer it is to 0, the more opaque. So go ahead, I'm going to pick like 0.6. So notice how it now has lightened up the bubble within our plot. Last note before we conclude our scatter plot. I'm sorry, I can't resist the dad jokes. You're just gonna have to bear with me on this call. It is a horror movie themed one. I can't resist it. To save your plot, we can use a function called ggsave. When we use ggsave automatically, what it likes to do is it takes the last plot that you've generated. So I'm just gonna type this from scratch, but you can uncomment this. So we could just like insert the file name of the plot. And then based on the suffix, whether it's PNG or JPEG, it'll render it accordingly. I like using PNG. And then you specify the dimensions of the plot. So we can use width 7. I've got it under here in height 5. And then units, there's a couple of different units that it takes for the purposes of today. We're going to use inches. And then one little trick when you're saving PNG files, so notice that this is all white. If I saved it as is, the PNG file is going to like look grayed out. The background's going to be totally removed. So you might want to add in another argument if you've got like a white PNG to define what the background color is. And you can go ahead and run that. And that should save to the directory that you set up at the very beginning. So if you're working in desktop, you should now see like a file called plot scatter or whatever you called your file name. All right, I think this is a good point to just pause real quick and open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, sure. That was wonderful. So you have one question from Akil. How to change the label collection name with the underscore to collection name with this white space between, for example. I think when...
Sure.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about the legend name, what we can do is we can change up the legend names for specific aesthetics by passing in the aesthetic variable name. So here, because color corresponds to collection name, to relabel that, you're going to go in labs and set color is equal to, and then you can even type in here collection name, and it'll change that. So it just has to correspond to your mapping here. So if you want to change like your popularity to uppercase, you do the same thing and you pick the size variable and then say this is the label for the variable pertaining to size. Great
Perfect.
Question.
Yeah. We have another question from Colleen. How to save your figure as a PDF?
Ooh, that's a good question. I typically save mine in PNG and JPEG. I think like when you're doing your R notebooks, there's also a way to save them as PDF, but I'm less familiar when it comes to like best practice for saving PDFs. I could definitely Google that one afterwards and get back to you.
Perfect. Do you have any other questions, please?
Okay.
A little bit, how can we modify the background?
Sorry, the bar count?
The background of the plot, the scatter plot.
Oh,
Toma?
Oh, yeah. So, well, I'm going to get into more of like modifying the background by building a custom theme in a couple of the other examples after this. But the way that we modify like the look and feel of plots is with themes. So the only thing that I've done here at the very end is added theme minimal. but you could call like this theme BW. When you start typing, there should be a couple of them that start popping up, theme classic or theme dark. You can go ahead and run that. Not the best look here, but we're going to get into all of the different things that you can do with customizing themes in the later plots. This is just an example of an out-of-the-box theme.
Yeah, so you have another question from Shah. How can we have place popularity and collection name with same color?
If you want to change the color, so if you want everything the same color, right? You don't want it to map to, let's say, collection name. What we can do is we can remove this, and we can actually add an argument within GOnPoint. Oh, this is wonderful. Mona, my mouse has actually died. I have to go in and grab another mouse.
Okay,
I apologize for this.
Okay,
but you can hold on just a moment.
It's okay.
Hold on. Let's see if this one works. Connected. Great. All right. I have very fast technical support on my end, so we're back. We'll go ahead and then you can pass in color. Notice we're not wrapping this in any aesthetic, and you could just say, I want the color to be red. Right. So if you just wanted to change it to one variable and you didn't want to map it, that's one way we could do it. But because we were comparing like different franchises, we're just going to add it here into our aesthetic mapping. Okay. Awesome. So we'll go ahead and get started on plot number 2. I will say the scatter plot to me, if I was into like data storytelling, I don't know if I could really glean much from this. This would be a cool one to use for like exploratory data analysis. Like I can see that most of them are clustered here, like under 100 million in revenue and a budget below 20. You definitely have some standout films above 250, but they're kind of a little bit all over the place, right? One thing that I thought might be cool for us to explore today is looking at the trends of movie releases by month and potentially by year. So before we get started, the first thing that we'll need to do is aggregate by year and months. So before we were just passing in like the records of each movie, but now we need to create a new data frame that is specific and gives us a count of how many movies by year and month. So go ahead in the code chunk below in pre-plotting. Let's go ahead and grab our original data frame df. We're going to use our friend dplyr, and we're going to use a couple of other functions within dplyr. So the first one I want us to use is called group by. So this is telling us what variables we're going to be aggregating. So we're going to be aggregating on the release year level. And then to specify additional variables, use a comma, pass in release month. And then to keep going, we're going to use summary functions within summarize. And this one's going to be very straightforward. I'm going to label this as count. And then to just get a quick count of everything you can do, count n. If you wanted to do like a count distinct, there's a couple of ways you could do that. There's a whole bunch of functions within that dplyr cheat sheet that you're welcome to check out. And then after doing that, we can go ahead and click run. Now you can see release year, release month, and count. I want us to go ahead and store this into an object called df monthly. And one last thing before we move on, because this data set spans all the way back into the 1950s, I want us to grab just the most recent years. So let's go ahead and filter our data set so we only see years between 2016 and 2021. So we can continue going with a filter. And this time we're going to say release year. And because it's numeric, we can do a greater than equals to 2016. To add additional criteria to our filter, go ahead and use an ampersand. And then I want us to take a quick preview of the data too. Okay. And then in our environment, we now have DF monthly with 6 observations, which should not be right. 2016. Release month. Okay. I know where we went wrong with our dplyr. I should say where I went wrong, so I apologize. So it's within casting release months, but that's okay. We can go ahead and fix this up right here in the code. What I want us to do before we group by, I want us to specify a mutate function again, and just go ahead and say release month is equal to format release date. I think I did like a capital M in the last one, so it was a conversion issue on my part. I can throw this into the chat as well if it makes it easier for folks. Let me go ahead and take a look at that. There we go. So I'm going to pass this into the chat. So this is just casting our release month properly. Okay. All right, so we should have now a total of 72 observations, and you can see it broken out. So you can see the movie count. We've got January of 2016, 151 movies, February, 78 movies, and on and on. Now to create our line plot using our data frame. And before we get into plotting multiple plots, which is going to be my favorite part in just a minute, I want us to just look specifically at months for 2021. So one last step. Go ahead and bring in DF monthly again and filter your data. And if we're just doing 1 year, you can use equal equals 2021. Okay. Now for the ggplotting part. So just like before, I want us to start with ggplot. And then for your data argument, you're going to pass in your new data frame DF monthly 2021. And for your mapping, go ahead and set your X equal to your release months, and Y is equal to our new variable called count, how many movies. When you're done mapping, put the plus symbol at the end, and then add your geom line. Go ahead and run the code chunk. All right. I'm going to go ahead and adjust the width on mine too. If you're having issues with the width, you can make this a little bit smaller. So now, right off the bat, I can see that the x-axis is being interpreted as a continuous scale because we passed in a numeric. It doesn't have the pretty breakup of 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 12. The other thing is that our y-axis doesn't start at 0, which is a big faux pas I hear in DataViz. So we want to make sure that our y-axis is scaled and starts at 0. But take a look at the graph. Are you surprised that there's a huge spike in horror movies right around October? I'm definitely not surprised. I think there's a number of them right now, including the new Halloween movie with Jamie Lee Curtis. So here we can definitely see a huge trend around October with releases of horror movies. But we want to make this a little bit more intuitive to read. So we're going to be working with our friend scales again. And this time, instead of using scales to change up aesthetics like colors, we can use scales to change up our other aesthetics, including X and Y. And because we're working with continuous variables for both of them, we'll be using scale X continuous and scale Y continuous to change up X and Y respectively. Another thing that we're going to get into is annotating. So annotations are really cool when you want to call out a specific observation in your plot. Annotations act like a geom layer, but they're a little bit different in the sense that if you don't have the text stored somewhere in the data, it's really useful to use annotate just to plot some text. And then we're going to be working with custom themes. I can't tell you how much Googling I did for memes over the weekend, but I really love this one because it pertains to my favorite subject of themes. So unlike Fred from accounting, we never forget the theme. In fact, I end up spending a lot of time working just with themes. Okay. So before we get started, another thing that I like to do is set up some of the colors in variables. So if you want to change them up later on, you just do that with one line of code instead of trying to find that in every section of your ggplot. So go ahead and run that code chunk. Now I want us to go ahead and get started with our line plot. If you're like me and you don't like the typing portion as much, you can go ahead and just copy. We're going to keep building on this. Go ahead and paste. Uncomment the GG save part as well. So now within this, I want us to do a couple of things. So we're going to say scale Y continuous. We're going to change up our Y scale. And now we want to specify that the limits should start at 0 and end somewhere, I think around like 500, right? We don't want it to cut off right at 90. So the way we can do that is with our limits argument. And then we're going to be passing the lower and upper bounds within a list. So you see in parentheses, your lower bound is going to be 0 and your upper bound is going to be 500. Go ahead and run. You can see it's now shifted our plot upwards. Now for the labeling trick with our x-axis. So here we have it reading as a continuous. We want to change this up directly in ggplot. We could say scale x continuous. And there's two things that we're going to be passing into scale x continuous. One is we want to change it up so that our labels are expressed at 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way until 12. The next thing we might want to do is we might not want to have the month number. Let's say we've changed our minds and we want to have the month abbreviation. There's a trick where we can pass in a list of values to express as the labels themselves. So let's go ahead and change this up and say breaks is equal to, you can pass in a list, but the easier, fast way to do this is by passing in a range of values within R. So I want us to do 1 colon 12. Now it's changed up the placement of it. And lastly, I want to pass in values, which is going to be my labels for things. So there's a function within R, I believe it's base R, called month.abbrev, ABB for abbreviation. And we're going to pass in that range of values, so 1 through 12. Oh. I'm guilty of making a ton of ggplot mistakes. So if you're new, it goes to show that it doesn't matter how long you've been ggplotting. Sometimes you go back to Google and you keep learning things, but I believe the argument is actually called labels. There we go. So now it's changed up the labels of our graph to the month abbreviations. It's looking a little bit better. I'm also going to change the figure width. I apologize. Okay. So moving on, let's go ahead and play with annotations. So we notice that there's a huge spike in October for Halloween movies. What if we wanted to call out that huge spike? One way we could do that is by passing in an annotate layer. So just like our geoms, we can continue to keep building. So pass in annotate. And then annotate is going to accept a few different arguments. The first thing is you're going to notice that it wants you to express what kind of geom it is. So annotate adopts the look and feel of either like a geom text or a geom label. Geom text is great just when you want to put in plain text. Labels have like a fancy border around it and a filled in background too. Let's just go ahead and work with geom is equal to text. And unlike our aesthetic mapping, you're going to notice that we're not using aesthetic to wrap in all these mappings. These are standalone. We're just passing in static variables. We're going to say x is equal to, and I will say that annotations are sometimes more art than science. But what I like to do is kind of eyeball where in the plot that I want to have the annotations. So I want it somewhere within the intersection of October and 400. specific call out, keep in mind that your x-axis, even though you've passed in new labels that are now appear like characters, it's still sticking to like a numeric variable. So we want to pass in 10 for x and 400 for y. And the last thing we want to do is add in a label, and you can pass in a string. So you can say horror movies released, let's say, right in time for Halloween. And go ahead and plot. Now you'll notice that this annotation doesn't instinctively know if the text is too long and it might cut off. So there's one way that we can wrap this text by using, I believe it's like a little bit of HTML. So I want us to go ahead and use the slash, or is it backslash n? Forward slash, it's a forward slash n. So when you add this piece of code in, it'll break it off right at that part of the text. So now you can see horror movies released right in time for Halloween. If you want to see what it looks like with a label, this is the only difference. So notice how it has a filled in background now and a border. There's other arguments where you can use to change that look up. And now my favorite part, which is working with custom themes. I want us to go ahead and get familiar again with labs. So go ahead and add in a title. So let's say horror movies released by month, 2021. X, we can call this month. Y, you can say number of releases or number of movies. You can also pass in that same caption if you want to call out the data source. All right. Okay, getting back to my friend's question about how to change up this ugly gray theme. Like, let's say you want to now go crazy with your own color palette. You're not satisfied with what you're seeing with the out-of-the-box themes. We can adjust many different aspects of this plot with a function called theme. And then within theme, there's a whole list of arguments that you can play with, anything from modifying the size of your title, which I still can't spell right, the size of your title, to the color of your background, to the color of these lines. And the thing to note within themes is that there's really 4 different element types that we're going to be working with. One is called element rect, which will help us with changing up the background colors of different components in the chart. We'll be working a lot with element text to change up the typography of certain parts of our plot, and element line to change up stuff like the grid lines and the axis colors. So let's go ahead and get started with our custom theme. So because it's spooky season, I think we need to go dark mode with this one. So let's go ahead and change up the color of our background. The way that we can do this is by specifying panel dot background. Element rect, and then we could say here the fill color. And I've already passed in some of the palettes and stored them as values. So I'm going to use pal BG, shorthand for background, to pass into element rect. If we go ahead and do this right now, I promise it'll look a lot better when we get there. I'm just going through it one by one. You'll notice that it's now darkened out the main chunk of the plot. It's also going to leave a white border around things if we don't specify the color. Let's keep going. So let's say we now want to darken the rest of it. We can say plot background. I want us to do the same thing. Type in fill BG, and this time I want you to add in color because color is going to represent the border color of the plot. Okay. So the important thing about dark mode is you want to create contrast, right? So if I'm using a dark color palette for my background, I want to be mindful that my text should be light enough for users to read. The grid lines are really harsh. And I also want to lighten up the line color as well, right? Because it's blending in with my background. So there's a couple of things that we're going to do. To change the line background, the line color itself, you're going to go back into geom_line, and you're going to express the color, and we're going to use green. You can use pink, you can use any color you want. I'm not going to limit you, but for my purposes, I'm going to be using green. And now to change up the majority of the plot text, it won't change all of it, but the majority of it, we're going to pass in an argument called text. And this time we're going to be using element text. And you can say color is equal to, and I believe I already have a palette for this, pal text, which is equal to white. And to change up the grid lines, to change up all of them, you can just type in panel.grid. But if you notice when you type in panel.grid, you get a bunch of different things. So if you want to be specific about changing up the major grid lines for the x-axis or y-axis or the minor ones, you can definitely, you have more flexibility to go more in detail. So you could say element line, color. There's another palette called pal grid. And then if you want to change the thickness of the lines, there's also an argument that you can use within an element line called size. So here, let's put in 0.2. Let's just go ahead and run that and see what that, oh. I'm sorry, folks, pal text for element text. All right, looks a little bit better. Notice that the text for the majority of the plot has changed. Only thing left over is the axis text. I honestly don't know why this isn't encompassed within text, but it's just another thing for us to modify. So the way we can change up the axis text color to axis.text, element text imported at the very beginning. And then always make sure to have the comma if that's not the last part of your theme. So now it's changed it up. Since Creepster is a little bit different in size than Roboto, I might want to increase the font size as well. So let's pass in like font size of 30. Maybe that's a little bit too big. Again, for me, sizing is a little bit more art than science. I'm sure there's some people who have cracked the code down with nailing down the right ratios, but sometimes it takes me a couple of tries to play around with the right size for text. If you want to change up the label colors, you can do that as well within annotate. So if you want to change up the background, change the fill color, you'll notice a lot of these words are kind of interchangeable. Anytime you change up a background of something, it's usually fill. For text, it's usually color. And set that to pal BG, so it's the same as our background. And to change the text color, you can use pal text. And that wraps up the line plot. We're going to do one more thing to this line plot. To save time, I want us to go ahead and copy paste the code we've already created. So we got a quick taste of how to create themes, how to work with lines, how to do some specific things with like plot title adjustments. Now moving on to the last part of the line chart, which is working with facets. And I think the first time that I got into ggplot, when I discovered facets, it was mind-blowing. The fact that you could create multiple plots without having to do ggplot all over again based on just like pivoting on a variable name was really cool. So use case for this one is, let's say now we want to explore the seasonality to see if it looks the same for other years, right? We just have that data for 2021, but does it look similar in 2016, or was this just like a one-off year? You and I might intuitively know, well, duh, of course it's gonna spike around Halloween time, but let's just go ahead and create a plot to see if it proves our hypothesis. So go ahead and paste in that code from the last plot. I want us to change up our mapping though for data. So instead of passing in DF monthly 2021, go ahead and pass in DF monthly. So it's that original data set we created. And that's going to have all the different years. We're going to add in one piece of code that's going to dramatically change the look of this plot, and it's called facet wrap. Again, you could add the facet wrap at the end. I prefer to add it somewhere at the beginning too. Facet wrap, and then you're going to specify which variable you're pivoting on. You're going to go ahead and use the tilde. I've been told that the other official name for this is the squiggle, but I believe it's called the tilde. So go ahead, use tilde, and then the variable name, which is going to be release year, because we want to see this iterated on for several different years. Go ahead and run the code. So for my friends who are really familiar with faceting, this should come as no surprise. When you pass in annotate for a facet, it's going to repeat the label over and over again. My recommendation for those who want to play with annotations and facets is to create like a different data frame and then plot it for a specific one, right? So you could plot it just for 2016, but there's not really an intuitive way of doing that with annotate. So for now, I want us to just go ahead and remove that annotate layer to get rid of the text. The thing that you notice that changes is that now you have a plot for each specific year. You have a bit of strip text at the top that's expressing which year it is. And it's keeping the same scales here for month and for number of releases. Let's say you want to change up the theme or look and feel of the little text at the top. You can continue to build on your custom themes. So the way that we do that is you start by calling strip dot background. And because we're modifying a background, we're going to be using element rect. And let's say the fill, you want to do purple. It's probably a nicer shade of purple with hex colors, but go ahead and fill in purple. And then to change the actual text behind it, so right now it's in black, go ahead and say strip. So it's essentially like dot notation where you've got that parent element and then you specify the text or background. So dot text, element dot text, color, and let's use the same palette. Just a moment as I troubleshoot here.
The plus is the comma. The comma is the
There's no comma.
After
I have a helper on the line.
After a purple, you've got a plus rather than a comma.
Oh yeah, you're right. Right there. Thank you. I'm so glad we have other ggplot aficionados on the line to help me as I'm going through this too. I'm also prone to make mistakes. So I use that plus symbol instead of the comma delimiter. So if you have that on there as well, just go ahead and add the comma. Not the greatest shade of purple. I think I had a different one in the solutions notebook, but you could play around with this and say, I want this to be like a darker shade of gray. And it would change up the background of the strip text. So overall, taking a look at this, if you looked at 2021 in comparison with other years, you kind of have that same witch hat effect, right? Where you're seeing that spike of horror movies released right around October. Awesome. All right, before moving on to our last and final plot, I want to open it up again for questions and also give folks just a moment to digest what we went through.
Yeah, sure. So you have a question from Brad. Can you change alignment of title text? I think she did, right? You did?
I think we went through that. So that for those who want to know how to adjust the positioning of your title text, so let's say you want it more in the center of your plot, you can do that with, let me just adjust the size of this because this is, all right. So for instance, with your plot title here, within element text, there's an argument called hdjust, which is going to shift the horizontal position of your text. So that's going to range from 0, which is all the way to the left, to 1, which is all the way to the right. So if you want it smack dab in the middle, just set it equal to 0.5. Great question.
Yeah, and you have a good link for the reference shared by Frank. You have another question from Hiba. She's not sure if we will go over this later, but let's say I'm adding data labels and they have decimal points. How to round the number to 0 decimals?
That's a great question, and I have that in plot number 3. So stay tuned. We're going to be going how to modify labels with functions exactly like rounding. So I'm glad someone brought that up.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you for sharing the link, Frank. Is there anyone else who has a question, please?
All right. And we can tackle more questions at the end.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Timmy.
I find it really difficult to type. So I was working on recreating a plot, but it wasn't made using ggplot, but I'm trying to recreate it with ggplot. But in one of the plots, there's a line graph, and one part of the line was cut into half, and some dots were used to replace a particular part, let's say from 10 to 15. I don't know if that's possible in using ggplot.
It sounds like a really interesting use case. And Timmy, I'd be happy to take a look with you after this call. If you've got an example of it, maybe we can figure out a way of how we could recreate it in ggplot. But for today, we're just sticking with basic line charts. You want to change up like your line to a dash type. There should be a function within geomline called, I believe it's called line type. Again, I do rely on some of the documentation for this too. Line type, and I think you could say dashed, where it might accept like a numeric value. So like you could definitely change up the styling of the line within geomline if you wanted to.
Yeah, I think I follow you on Twitter, so I think I'll just send a screenshot. It's like that, but one part was still straight, not dashed, and one part was dashed. So I don't know.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to take a look at it with you afterwards. So feel free to message me and we'll tackle it.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, last but not least, getting into bar plots. For bar plots, I think a lot of the times that I've used bar plots is to compare like discrete variables against quantitative measures. So for this one, I thought it'd be cool to dive into horror movies and look at a list of them by revenue, specifically like the top 10. So we're going to be working with our original data frame, but this time, instead of aggregating data, we're going to be using our friend dplyr to create a rank and just to select the first 10 rows. So within our pre-plotting code chunk, go ahead and call in our data frame variable again, pass in the piping operator, and then go ahead and say arrange. So arrange is going to let us reorder our data frame based on a specific variable, in this case, revenue. And when you type in revenue, the first thing that it's going to default to is it's going to rank it in ascending order. We want it in descending order because we want the top movies. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can either negate revenue, so it's ranking it based on a negative revenue, or I think the more official way that you could do that is by plugging in a function, the function descending. So now it'll do it in descending order. And then keep going with our piping operator. And I want us to just select a couple of different variable names. I don't want us to bring in all different, I think there's like 20 columns. So the columns we're going to be calling in are title. I want us to bring in a release year, revenue, budget, and our newly created variable poster URL. Last part of our dplyr data manipulation here, we want to just call in the first 10 rows. So one way that we can do this is by using that head function, similar to how we previewed data. And this time we're just going to pass in the number 10 to bring in the first 10 rows. Go ahead and let's just preview what that looks like. And because we're going to be working with this data set for our ggplot, I want us to store it in a new data frame variable. So let's go ahead and call this df underscore top underscore movies. So now if you look at your data frame environment here, you have 10 observations all the way from it at 700 million, all the way down to Black Swan at 329. I don't know if I personally classify Black Swan as a horror, but I guess it works. I'd see it more as like a drama movie, but definitely some old classics on here with Jaws and The Exorcist. Now let's go ahead and visualize our data. Now, I think best practice when it comes to bar plots, if you're working with really long, discrete variable names like movie titles, it's better to see it as a horizontal bar chart than it is with a regular bar chart, because the amount of space that you're going to have on that x-axis is going to be limited. It's more intuitive to read it at the y-axis level. So we're going to plot y to title and x to revenue. So we're going to start the same way we've been starting the past two plots. For data, let's go ahead and pass in df top movies. And then for our mapping, use aesthetic. I want us to go ahead and map x to revenue and y to title. And then keep going by adding the geom layer, and the geom layer that we're going to be using is geom call. I know there's going to probably be some questions between geom call and geom bar. I believe with geom call, you can map like the width of columns to a specific variable versus bar. I don't believe you can, but for today's purposes, we're just going to go ahead and use geom call. Then I want us to get familiar with labs. So go ahead and plug in the title of it. Let's say top 10 horror movies by revenue. Your x-axis is going to be revenue. Let's plug in millions. And y, I don't think we need a title for this one because it's a movie title. So if you want to get rid of the y-axis title, one way that you can do it is just by passing in an empty string. And go ahead and plot that. Okay, so this is our starting plot. So far, it's done its job, but what we notice is that ggplot will plot this based on the ascending order of discrete character names. So it starts all the way from A Quiet Place all the way to World War Z. So let's say you want to change up the look of this plot so you have it in descending order because we're creating that classic top 10 graphic. There's a couple of things that we can do. So moving on to the next thing, I want us to go ahead and copy paste the code just for the sake of time and paste it down here. So in this step, let's work with reordering it. So we now see it based on descending order of revenue instead of based on the title name. And I also want us to go ahead and play around with layering geoms. So in this bar graph, I want it to be explicit about what revenue number it is for each one. So we can add like a little text label at the end of each bar to express the revenue. But first, let's go ahead and reorder. So one thing we can do is we can adjust it within our mappings. So now that we have X is equal to revenue, Y is equal to title, we're going to switch this Y mapping up a little bit and introduce reorder, which I believe is a base R function. And you're going to say reorder title, comma, and you're going to insert the variable that you're ordering by, which is revenue. Let's see here. Oh, always important to keep track of your parentheses. So make sure that your parentheses are closed out. All right, so now it's reordered it based on revenue. There's a couple of other hints that you can look at. I recommend looking into like setting up factors if you have more complicated reorderings. But for our purposes, this one is a really quick trick of how you could just reorder by one of the variables within your data frame. All right, the next part of this is we want to introduce geom text with this. So this is how we're going to be adding in different layers to our bar plot. So just like geom call, we're going to go ahead and enter and then insert geom text. I always add the plus sign at the very end. And we want to expand on geom text because we need to pass in the label for the mapping. And I want us to be clear that mapping, we can either do at that parent level or we can do it at individual geom levels. If you want like a mapping to keep cascading towards every single geom, I recommend including it here at the top. If there's specific things that only pertain to one geom, it's best practice to map it at the geom level. So within geom text, we're going to be using a very similar mapping argument here. Mapping is equal to AES. We don't need to specify X and Y again because it's borrowing it from the parent level, but we do need to pass in the label of what we're going to be changing. So let's map label to revenue. All right. You notice in our plot, one, it's not at the very outside of our bar chart, right? We want it to be hovering just a little bit at the end. And then I believe we had the question from earlier, which was perfect, which is how do you change up the labels with rounding? So let's go ahead and do both of those things and modify our geom text mapping. So if you want to round the label, you can actually create the function within the mapping. So you can go ahead and say round, comma. Let's say we just want to round it to no decimals. The other thing that we want to do is we want to push the position of the text so it's just outside of the bar graph. So we want to modify this X mapping specific to this geom. So you're going to keep going by saying X is equal to, and then I want us to say revenue. We can also add a function. So I want to say revenue and then add a little bit. So it's now hovering like 20 points outside of this. By the way, this is also a little bit more art than science in terms of figuring out the right function to shift the text over. I've played around with this a little bit in the past, so I'm going to add 20, but I don't always get it right on the first try, just as a footnote. Okay. Last thing that we're going to do here, I want us to add in our friend scale X continuous. And the reason that I want to add this in is to show you how to remove this little chunk of space between the 0 and the end of this. So there's always like that little bit of padding that you'll get in a plot. And to remove this, you can use an argument called expand. And then pass in a list where you're removing the additional padding around that. So if you run this, it'll look a lot cleaner because now it's going to shift that bar all the way to the y-axis. Our text also cuts off here, so we might want to expand the limit or the upper bound. So let's go ahead and adjust that limit in scale X continuous and say limits. And let's do it to 750 because the movie It caps around 702 million. Great. All right, a couple of additional modifications before we move on to the next trick. I want to just check how we're doing on time. For the next one, we'll do a code walkthrough of how it's done, since it does employ GG image. So now if you wanted to continue by expanding on your themes, we could plug in like our dark mode theme again. And for the sake of time, I might actually go in and borrow the theme that we used for our line chart. So if you want to go back in and copy paste the theme that we created, let's go back to our bar chart. And we're going to modify the color of the bar and the color of the text. So go in, call out white, and then for the color of the bar chart, we can pass in fill. And then I've picked a shade of red here at the top, where you can now add this in. So it's going to plot all of our movies, and now you have the column, and you also have the text expressed. If you want to change the width of each column, you can also do that with an argument called width. That might be a little bit too skinny, but if you want to do like 0.8, it'll modify the whole chart. Now I know we're running short on time, so I want to be mindful of everyone's evening, morning, and afternoon. Let's go ahead and just do a code walkthrough of one of the solutions for the advanced plots. So if you have more time and you want to explore GG extensions, this is a really cool trick that you can do. And I will also expand this to make it a little bit clearer. So for like an advanced bar plot, one of the things that I've added in is GG image with geom image. So if you want to plot like an image from a URL, you can do this with geom image. So like we had those movie posters in, we could pass in the poster URL. Let's say you want to add the poster URLs at the end. You can add that in. You can change the positioning of the text. And then there's also a couple of code snippets of how to work with annotations and arrows. So we got a taste of annotations during our line plot part, but let's say the annotation is placed weirdly. You might want to draw a line either with geom segment or geom curve to call that out. So there's a couple of examples of how you could do that in here. The end result of it will show something like this. So here, all I've done is I've removed the labels of your y-axis. I've plotted the image with geom image. So if you want to take a look at the code of how to do that, here's a code here. So all you're doing within the mapping is setting that x variable. And then you're passing in a new argument here called image with the poster URL. And then you've got the annotation, which should look familiar from our last exercise. So here I've got an annotation that calls out the movie budget. I've overlaid budget here to kind of create that bullet graph field, so you can compare revenue versus budget. And there's a little text here that says movie budget with the arrow. So it's just using a geom curve. And to be honest, geom curves took me like 10 tries. It did not happen on my first plot. I saw someone use it for their first one ever the other day, and I was amazed. Definitely a little bit of working around with geom curves, but I just wanted to show everybody what's possible in ggplot. I know this was an intro course. Hopefully there was some tips and tricks for everybody on here, but really there's so much you can do with it, and the learning doesn't stop here. I widely encourage everybody to keep going. If you're a big horror movie buff, go ahead and play around with a data set. There's 35,000 different movies. There's probably tons of information you can glean from it. If horror movies aren't your thing, I recommend checking out Tidy Tuesday. It's an amazing online community of our users. That's how I got into ggplotting. It was all thanks to people who share their code and help troubleshoot online. So I encourage everyone to keep going with ggplot. I hope everybody had just as much fun as I did. I'm sorry if we went over a little bit, but this has been a blast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for this wonderful workshop. I don't know if people still have some questions. Yeah, that was amazing. I can see I have really nice feedback in the chat. So I will make, yeah, when do you, so I have a nice question from Frank. When do you present GG Animate? So yeah, you could, we try to make, to organize a meetup about that. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks a lot, Tanya, again. So last thing, I would encourage you to try to use ggplot2 on your own and like share with us your plots that you'll be creating using this hashtag on Twitter. We want to, I will make sure to share with you the recording video later. Thank you all for joining us. I will just share with you a link to for a feedback form. Have a good day or good night for everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.